morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started here, even though it's a little early, welcome to Making PIMS Painless Easier Processing with Better Data. There will not be Act 48 for this session, so I just wanted to pass it on because of the type of presentation that it is. And let's welcome Mr. Chuck Pickens.
Good morning, everyone. I didn't know there was credit for this. We've done a pure demonstration of the MMS, which is not what we're supposed to do here. The branding isn't blatant or anything of that nature. But this session itself is really about how we as a company and things that we can share within your own student information systems, the kinds of things that we do that might improve processing of data, better data, for better outcomes. Okay. I'll have to excuse a little bit of the marketing that we've done with the title slide. We're aware that PIMS is misspelled. We know what the acronym means very well. We spend a lot of time and resources to make sure that our clients are compliant with the rules and the many changes that are introduced on an annualized basis. MMS is the Student Information Platform, and we're going to explore what it's like to integrate business rules into Student Information Platform and the benefits that you might have for your processes and the luxury of supervising staff that are helping you with getting data into a system. Okay? Just what we thought we were meeting here about here this morning? Yeah, great.
I thought you were going to give us some tips.
Give us some PIMS, yes. Apparently there happens to be a PIMS cocktail. If many people have asked about it, it's something that we're serving at our booth. It's a little bit sweet. Going down, it's a very refreshing reward to any kind of a submission deadline that you have. Okay? Really what we're talking about here is making PIMS less painful for you by integrating these business rules into your standard operating procedures. Okay, so that's really the title there, to make processing easier with better data. The first thing that a company can do, and certainly something that I think that PDE tries to do and attempts to do, is to use documentation to share the new business rules. Right? At the beginning of every year, we've seen over the past 8 or 9 years since PIMS was implemented here in Pennsylvania, that there's a process of either webinars describing loosely what the new requirements and business rules are, and then following that at some point with the actual written rules and business rules that are built into this year's submissions or past year's submissions. So documentation can be a really important part, and the way that one can put this in place is with the documentation. One of the things that can be done, which is very helpful within a student information system, is doing the crosswalk. Russ, is that the right term? The crosswalk between PIMS data and the data that exists inside of your student information system. I've always found that some kind of an appendix that describes in any given template the data that PIMS talks about, right? The data that exists inside of your student information system and the business rules that apply to that field, okay? So when you're talking about a new data element, knowing where that exists is pretty important, both for where it exists in the interface of the software, as well as the rules that go along with that. So that's an important part, and with the revisions that describe the new business rules and the new requirements for the year, it's a place where a student information system can also describe how those revisions will. I'm so sorry. First thing I do is turn this off.
Turn it down.
Now you know some of my preferences for music. It's those nights that you get there and you go into the App Store, and what ends up happening is you run into something like, I don't know, cool ringtones, so I have all these sounds now that I have attached to my sisters and my brother.
And who is that, Chuck?
So So there's one that says, your sister's calling, you know, it's all these, and so you get a whole bunch of those, and it's like, what did I spend $20 on? And that was one of them, not that that one's necessarily funny. So the revision history is a way that you can incorporate your business rules into your student information system, and if you don't get documentation that sort of support that, you really should demand it of your sys vendor, if that makes sense. Another thing that can be done is the efforts of professional development because not everybody learns the same, right? There's stuff that you can read, you can put out a 400-page PIMS documentation on your student information system, but to have other methods of supporting the changes in addition to the documentation. Things like knowledge base articles that sort of draw a line through the procedures within your software is pretty important. Webinars. You know, the state provides a webinar about the changes. We do these things in tandem with our releases for clients so that they have an understanding in a different way with the trainer to go through what the changes are that are for a submission or for a year period. And then we essentially you know, reinforce that as a supplemental resource. We record this stuff and we make it available for clients to view or use for the submission that may be throughout the year. Okay, so it's really the documentation is a foundation of understanding for those business rules. The next area, really, when we think about PIMS, we think about data. Lots of new data elements that often ends up happening, and we can really attack business rules. I think have an opportunity to attack business rules. God bless you. Within the user interface of the software, right? So that staff members, hopefully, you know, you're not a silo of entry of these fields, that you have staff members in each building that help along with the different submissions throughout the year. And so the user interface is a pretty important place to do that. One opportunity that you have is that, you know, just think of the student template. There's 201 fields, or 200 plus fields. Some of those are blank columns, but there's a lot of data elements in there, right? That you wouldn't necessarily always track for your own reporting purposes. So certainly some of it's just for the state, but it all relates back to funding. One of the things that you could think about is, you know, something that we do, and that is we load some default or common field values into records as they're entered into the system. Okay, so some of the very common ones would simply be, what's my AUN number? Why should I make a staff member enter that stuff in there? The school code, if I'm enrolling them in a particular elementary school or middle school or a district, why do I have to put a 4-digit code into the interface, right? If there are common items, and I think we have about 20 of them when you enter in a new record, that, you know, 99.9% of the time it's a yes or it's a no. Those things are loaded in, and then the staff really, as they're going through the interface of the software and those responsible for entering data elements, they're able to, you know, change something that's the exception rather than having to put in, you know, the common elements into the software. Right? So these things certainly will aid in better data. Another important opportunity that I think that your student information system has is, you know, the actual great question. And it's as if this machine, I powered it down on purpose, because having tools like that really will aid in better data, right? That if a new field comes out and you have, you know, 4,000 students in your school district, and there is a value that makes sense, you can populate that all at once. Even conditional edits, you know, test against this data, test against that data, and then populate this field. That's a very common tool. One of the things that we, where's my present button? Guess I should have just started. That's one of the automation tools, and I'll talk about that in a moment a little bit further. But we strive really in terms of taking all this time and the effort to put in business rules into the program itself and the interface, so that you're really not manipulating data outside of the student information system. Which means that when you get through these submissions and you're working through that, if that data is relevant in the future year, if it's relevant for the next submission, you don't have to repopulate it again. It's crazy to think about putting data just into an Excel spreadsheet for an upload when you have to do that 3 times a year or 4 times a year, right? Sometimes we do it out of expediency, right? We just do it because it's the 11th hour and it has to be done. But at all costs, if you can avoid that, that would be a good thing, right? So you don't have to populate that again, and you don't have to make sure that the values you have in there are going to be the same as the last time outside of the program. So it's really important that you follow that. One of the things that we do in the user interface here is we use the business roles in the interface. Up here we have a technique that we use where we color code field labels, right? There's a legend that says that anything in black is required, right? The staff member knows when they get to a screen for PIMS entry, right, that everything in black needs to be filled out. Something has to be filled out into those fields, right? Anything green is conditionally required, right? So this field here, and I just picked some of them out because we're not supposed to do demonstrations of our student information system, so I didn't want to put a screenshot in here. But this is just one, and that's conditionally required, right? There's a business role related to that. That's documented in the help system, that's documented by PIMS in those hundreds of pages of manuals, right? Blue, which typically I would say that you can leave that blank because it's optional, right? It doesn't make a difference if you enter it in there. And I don't know if blues will always become optional fields, will at some point become required, but they exist in the interface because it exists in the templates that go through the PIMS. Okay? Another thing that we often do is that for our PIMS-specific screens, how about putting the business role, not the business role necessarily, but the reference point, right, to the file submissions themselves. Field position 88, field position 66. That's what those numbers mean within our interface for PIMS-specific fields. And people seem to share feedback that that's helpful to them as they're working through their submission. This is a no-brainer, but certainly valid choices, fields, and screens. Whenever possible, if you could make sure that your vendor, your student information system, controls that from an update perspective, that means that you don't have to take the new fields and put it in an interface for staff members. This whole step here is all done, with an update, and that's always helpful to get it in front of people quicker, to make sure that the role sets are out there for them, and that your IT staff doesn't have to do a lot of work to make that, to put those business roles, really, those valid choices into place, those fields added to the system. That's all related to the exports. If it's done wrong, you have to manually add fields and manually add the valid choices. You could end up with bad data on the back end, right? Info spots. Mouse over info spot right on the screen, depending on how much data. And we're talking about a lot of data, but they're very helpful in telling you why that's conditionally required, right? Put these business rule right in front of the person that's entering the data, so they know, oh, well, this kid is a graduating senior, or is a dropout, so I have to fill this data element out. Without having to go to those 400 pages or those 250 pages in a manual to tell you what that role is, right? So if we can integrate the business roles into the interface of the software, it becomes pretty powerful for getting better data out of the system. I have more, but I wanted to give us an opportunity to talk about other user interface ideas that you either experienced or have dreamed about, that you always wanted for the tasks that you have in front of you. Do you have any ideas of what other things that you could do in terms of the user interface?
What about like a pop-up message, let's say you enter a new student, and you enter their PIMS information as well, as you have it available at that point in time. When you save that record, that a message would pop up for anything that you may be missing.
Okay.
Homeroom field. I know that's always missing, the homeroom field. Until the student schedule's done, and then that is the population of it.
So with that idea? Do you think that you could continue on and come back to it later? It's just a reminder, or
Yeah,
is it
it's nice
you
to
can't go to
just-
lunch without entering in the?
Sometimes you're in a hurry and you may miss one or two fields. And like I said, when you save the record, it would go right through a spot check and see what is missing, and just give you reminders, you need to do this, this, and this. Yeah.
Okay.
Instead of waiting to like run the PIMS export and then you get your error report of what you're missing. from the
Okay.
export.
All right.
To do it ahead of time.
That's a good idea.
Are any fields populated with any other systems? Like, we have an IP record, and then the date, the new IP put in, and there's a new date, we automatically, we have to, right now, currently we go over and I enter a new date.
Okay. So something about crosswalking data into, that's probably the wrong term, but bringing data back in from another system that you depend on that may be involved in these submissions. Okay. I'm going to comment on these in a moment with my experiences. Yes.
I just have a couple fields. Special ed, when they exit, like in its 2 year, you have to remember to go in and change that yourself. Could there be a date put in there that it'll automatically switch over? Or just a spot that puts a date in when they exited, so that you don't have to go into notes and or another system like IEP Writer to say that they were,
Right.
you know what I mean?
I have
Yep.
the same problem.
And then the other, and maybe it's just I'm not doing the rollover right, but when you, are retained, like if they were retained last year, and I roll that kid over, they're still showing that R there. Am I not rolling it correctly, or is there a way for that retention to come out for the next year?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
That was the retention, the
I have that problem too,
IEP.
because you always, just when you have your retention children and you roll your data over, it doesn't automatically clear that for you.
Yeah, it doesn't.
For the new year, you have to win it manually, and there have been times.
But if you
sometimes
forget, then
it
you
takes
wanna
you
know
2
what,
years.
yeah, right, 2 years, as a retention, yeah. Okay.
So these are all good ideas that you certainly want to take back to your student information system and see if they can build those things in there, or at least identify a path to get to it, right? I can comment on a couple of these. Sometimes I do hear about, well, Chuck, can your student information platform, can it not let my secretary leave the screen unless she fills out the required fields or the conditionally required fields, right? And we service 12, 13 states with some kind of state reporting element to it. And we've tried that out in the past. Pennsylvania wasn't the first state that we serviced that had gone into a PIMS-like submission process, right? And we did try that out once before in an interface, and we didn't let them use the screen. And it was shot down horribly by the end users, because they really, who knows what's going on in their life in front of them, right? That they should be able to just simply save and move on and come back to it later on, right? And so we tend not to let enhancements like that get into our user interface for our business rules, because in practical matters it doesn't really play well. The idea that you have about at least notifying that, hey, that this stuff still needs to be, it's required upon exit, I think is a good one. I've started to see that in an interface that we're working on for some enhancements for the product, and I can share that in everyone that happens to use the MMS, you'll see some of that in the future for the MMS, about these reminders of required fields, but allow them to still continue on with their work. Okay, and that would be done on a field by field basis. For stock fields, that's something that is done by your own distinction, right? And for PIMS, it certainly could be done on a basis of just compliance. Okay. Bridges. That certainly is something in the next screen itself here. And one of the reasons why I used economically disadvantaged status is because it's an example of what we can do with strong partnerships with products that are really quite good out there in the market. And it doesn't make sense to try to develop something ourselves, right? So IEPwriter.com is used by 95% of the districts or LEAs here in Pennsylvania. There's a bridge that walks data back and forth, right? We've done focus groups personally to take those new business roles of not just are they special education or not, yes or no, but to take the data and interpret it. The first method that we did something like that was to provide additional data fields that would have the data that could be analyzed for that piece, but that's being built into the bridge. And those kinds of partnerships with your third-party products are pretty important. With the economically disadvantaged status, that all is a byproduct of free reduced lunch applications, right? Direct certifications that you have. And so if you have a cafeteria component that's a strong partner, is one that you offer, like we do, economically disadvantaged status, participation, eligibility are all pieces that just are a byproduct of an application being filled in or a direct certification that's brought into the system, okay? And so those three fields specifically are brought in to and maintained by another application, right? Because it makes sense. Pardon me?
There's not a bridge like IEP writer.
It's a transactional. It's just when it happens, it doesn't. No, it's I'm sorry. Both of what I'm talking about are automated, meaning that you don't have to touch the record, right? In our particular instance, right? This is about more of a generic topic, right? Our particular instance, it's a 24-hour cycle, for the IEP writer. With our cafeteria option, it's transactional, so it happens as the free reduced lunch application is being filled out by the food service director, or the file's been imported for direct certification. Okay? So they're both automated. I was just making the distinction that one's a 24-hour cycle bridge, and the other one's transactional. So Teresa, you're shaking your head. You have our cafeteria option in place, and you don't have to maintain those three fields,
I
right?
do nothing, it's automatically input, it's already there, and I never have to manually enter or edit any free and reduced information whatsoever. And it automatically pulls in my uploads in my students' files.
And these business roles don't have to just be one way, right? What does IEPwriter.com need that doesn't inherently exist in their system? And that's the PA Secure ID, right? If you're using that product and you're not using, your student information system special education templates, that product needs PA Secure IDs, right? That's one of the data elements that go from, or can go from your student information system into your special education product, so that the special education department gets whatever the registrar's putting in, including name and address of the contact, right? So these partnerships are pretty important if done right to implement these business rules.
I just have a comment on that. It's also important that the district be a partner in the process, because there are some things that you may need to tailor at your level, that people aren't overriding each other, or that you get different security groups than you had before.
Right.
All right.
So these, let me sort of bring these up. I'm going to bring them up as one because we've talked about them a little bit, right? Just so that I don't have to be too repetitive as these bullets come up, if that's okay. So using roles within your student information system and the tools that are available to get better data is pretty important. Some calculated elements, certainly when you do exports to support the PIMS templates, they're not all just rearranging the data elements. A lot of it is calculated from within the program and data elements together. Think of enrollment dates or membership time periods, teacher responsibility. Some of it's not full, some of it's wherever logic can be applied, that data is being brought together for you and you can make further edits. But having not just a rearrangement of data elements in a format is pretty important for business rules. Mapping is huge in so many areas. You already had before 2005, 2006, before PIMS became something that implemented here in Pennsylvania, standard operating procedures. right? You have something that's been in place for some time that produces results with the data that you're collecting. And you want to make sure that you have the ability to still keep those tracking elements in place while still serving the needs of the state, federal government, other types of products that you're collecting. And so there's a big effort that we make so that oftentimes the data that you already have in your system can be mapped and used in the way that the state wants it, but you can still perform your standard operating procedures. Think of the many changes for entry codes, withdrawal codes, right? Some people really like that granular tracking of membership that goes back to the old green forms, right? Before all these systems were in play, right? And so that becomes very important. Mapping, for those of you that have heard, maybe for the first time, but I doubt it, like the early warning system, mapping is used entirely for 15 templates to be extracted, uploaded to the state on an automated basis. If it weren't for mapping, nobody would use it, right? If there wasn't an easy way of getting the data so that all that research-based dashboard that companies like MMS and others that I try to make sure supported as well, it would never happen if there wasn't an easy flow of data, right? There's always a benefit and cost to everything that you're going to adopt. And the early warning system, with the advent of mapping, really, or the use of mapping, allows something like that, a dashboard like that, that's free here in Pennsylvania, to go from the data that you already have, a byproduct of that data, into a usable format that is free by the state, right? And so for those of you in cohort 1, or those of you that are still signing up now for cohort 4, we support the state's efforts and putting this in place with free implementation services for our clients that want to use that kind of a tool. And mapping without this, it wouldn't be possible. The state's not even collecting attendance, day-to-day attendance information. They're not collecting less reportable offenses for discipline. They're not reporting or asking you to collect grade detail, right? These are all things that exist inside of a student information platform like MMS and can feed and provide really rich, useful information for your student assistance program, okay? So that's pretty important. Data transformation operations.
Chuck, question here.
It goes a little bit to your comment before. Is there ways? Yes. I'm sorry.
Chuck, in that dashboard type stuff that you were looking at, in the course catalog, there's exclusions from PIMS and the EWS. Is there any way to make an inclusion into the EWS? Because there's classes that I don't send for PIMS that I want to include in the dashboard.
So what I'm writing down is more of a question of how does the effect of the exclude a course from PIMS reporting affect the dashboard itself? And if it does affect that, and it shouldn't, to ask why, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to exclude from PIMS and be able to include
I think
for the
there's
dashboard.
two separate fields for that in your course. There is an exclude from PIMS and an exclude from EWS.
But if I exclude from PIMS, does it submit for EWS?
Yeah, you have to actually unselect it from, you have to check the box for exclude and include. I believe, I could be wrong,
I
but I
had some
believe.
errors on that, but it could be from something else
Okay.
too, that was
Yeah.
preventing it from going in. I assumed it was from that.
Oh,
It could have been something
yeah,
else.
because I know I checked.
Every course that you want to include has to have a department. I'll just offer that and we can follow up.
Otherwise it won't pull, yeah.
Yeah, it won't put me that.
And it needs to be correct,
Right.
otherwise it
It does.
does.
Data transformation operation gets to your point for either mass editing, these two bullets right here, right? You really need a tool that will allow you to enforce those kinds of rules for those new data elements, those new requirements that you have, right? Transformation operations. My favorite example for this would be, we have 5 ethnic codes, then we had 6, and then we had Hispanic code, and check the ethnicities that apply, right? And so the big task initially is how do we take this one field and make it into these six fields, right? There are six fields that you would populate. So a transformation tool that we did that was good for data quality was, let's logically interpret the ethnicity field that you often use for federal reporting or for some other reportings, right? Not everybody gets that granular. And then interpret that into Hispanic yes or no and the ethnicities that apply, right? And that is something that still exists today in our system, where when you go to export, you can say run this transformation operations from ethnic data, and it not only does it for the file, but it does it at the record level, so that no one has to maintain that again. Okay, it's a pretty popular piece. And then having an exception report that backs up the rest of that, right? There's no logical step if you're maintaining multiracial in the ethnic field to know what it means for Hispanic, non-Hispanic, and which other ethnicities should be flagged off yes or no. And so it tells you which records, or you want something to tell you which records still need to be paid attention to, right? So that you have that moving forward. So that's pretty important. These kinds of things for the conditional edits, I can't imagine that that's not something that you wouldn't want to demand from a student information system regardless, right? You just need that kind of control at that level. Once in a while, I'll hear about it that doesn't exist, and that surprises me. But if you like to work within Excel, then I guess that's okay. But it doesn't get you back into the data itself. Field population was really my way to start talking about good partnerships with other strong products that you're using that come into play for PIMS reporting, like cafeteria, like special education type data. Things that could aid in getting data into the system would be importing PIMS student templates, right? It's data that when you get a transfer student or you're a vocational school, and you get a bunch of kids that are being sent into your vocational school, that you should really consider asking the sending district, can you send me your PIMS template for that student population, right? It should have some way. I can't imagine that the strength of this wouldn't be out there. You should have some way to identifying a group, a cohort, a group of students that you can then generate a PIMS student template for, that you can then import into your student information system, so that you have all that data entry done as an operational standpoint, right? And so for those in the room that are MMS clients, right, there's a knowledge base article that talks about how to set up the import operation, and just recall and use it as you need, and the things that you should pay attention to once you've imported, right, into the system. Anyone else here, do you import student files at all for transfer students? Import student files. Import PIMS student template files for transfer students or vocational students? Do you like the idea, or does it sound a little crazy? Yeah, it'd be great for us. What's wonderful about it is that all that documentation, that foundation of understanding, is the same for everyone. It doesn't make a difference which student information system that it comes from. If they have a common output, that's something that you could use and bring into your system. Okay? So this really starts to get into from passive to proactive steps that you can take into the workflow and the processes that you can put in place to improve data. And so there are some things that even with my own clients that I share about some procedural steps that can really aid into doing what the state started preaching a number of years ago, which is you're not supposed to be silos of entry for all this data. You really want to employ other staff members in the district, not so much to be on your payroll, but for some of their time. And they do that in an effort, one, to make sure that PIMS administrators know that it's okay. Two, your superintendent's seeing that as well. And sometimes, making sure that the leader of your LEA is behind you, providing some supervisory role over staff members to, do the work that they're expected to do is pretty important, right? And so helping staff help you is a pretty key component to the first step in that process. And one of the things that we do that you may loosely do at some level, right? But in our health documentation, we have checklists for every single template that comes out of MMS. That sort of talks about the things that you should be doing, or make sure on a macro level, if you will, that the elements that really need to be done prior to doing the template, right? And so this is just an example, but you might even take something like this, and the key, though, I think, is to marry it with stock reports, and I emphasize stock because you don't want to be writing SQL statements or writing reports. You want to use the tools that are within your student information system to be able to check or have your staff members check on whatever the checklist items are, right? So that by the time you go and you do your submission, or you get closer to your submission, is the reality of it, right? That you have cleaner data, you have better data. Even after all the visual cues and everything that we've talked about so far, it's pretty important, right? And so having these checklists, marrying them with stock reports within your system I think is pretty key. And directing staff with standard operating procedures to perform those, or for you to perform them yourselves as PIMS administrators, will take you a long way. Validation reports for oversight. I think in the description of this session, I talked about it as a luxury, because it always seems that folks, when they talk about PIMS, they're talking about it as an effort in the final stretch, right? Depending on what the changes are, that's valid. Other times it's not. One of the things that we do to integrate these business rules into the system to help our PIMS administrators is to include validation reports when you're doing the export, right? When you're doing the template creation, right? And so this is another one of those things that I feel so good about myself when I can share it with the client, that, hey, how about a different use of this? How about this is not just the use for you to have and to provide some guidance, pretty much what you were talking about, like upon exit, tell me what I still need to fill out. And you were talking about the export report, I forget how, exception report when you're exporting. But this is a pretty powerful tool, right? Just think about it. Now I ran this against the high school. You could run this K-12 and whatever the template would drive for it there. But I know that with Abia student's last name, and this ID number, and that state ID number, that's not valid, it's not long enough, but it's a dummy database, that these are the elements that fail the business rules for that record and the associated template, right? It's a to-do list. For the students that are in this report, go fix these records. Not you as the PIMS administrator, but the secretarial staff, right? And so these things can be saved to a PDF and attached to an email and sent out and copied to your superintendent if you have like a real problem supervising this person. But this can be run at any time, meaning that this, not just within the MMS Student Information Platform, but you should be able to run your exports, especially if the business rules are built into it. You're not expected to work so much in Excel. It's a to-do list. That's hey, this is where you went to lunch and you forgot to come back and do this, or this is the data elements that really need to be finished for me to do a successful submission. Not that there wouldn't be anything left over by the time you get to that. But you do this a month in advance, 2 months in advance of a submission, weeks in advance, you have to come out with better data in the end. Unless you just have a secretary or secretaries that are ignoring your request, which is the reason why you might want to copy as superintendent, right? To be involved in something like that, yes.
Is there a way to run that report to get those errors without running the entire export? Okay.
No. Because the reason why is because sometimes it's not just a test, depending on which the template is. Sometimes it's not just a test against the data elements that are there. Sometimes it's calculated data, right? And so some of the rules will fail because of that, and you don't get that calculation until you run the export, right? But there's no harm in running this and having a phantom file out there, right? If you know the file naming conventions, they have dates in them and the AUN number of the school district, and to run this, it's a recalled setting, within our student information system. So the choices that you have to run it should be okay, right? You could even move, once you start seeing them pay attention to this, you could say, the next step would be another recommendation, would be, we want you to run it yourself for your school, right? And then you run it every once in a while just to see if they're really doing that. Those may be some pie in the sky kind of ideas, but if the tool's there, think of creative ways of using it, right? These are just some of the other, I just put together a couple screenshots of the data for some of the templates, and there's many of them. This is all in an effort to make sure that the data is being maintained in the source, not outside of it, right?
Chuck?
Yes.
Regarding the staff.
Yes.
Would there be any way to,
That's the last one I have up here, yeah.
put the, regarding HQT, to cross-reference the teachers' assignments and certifications with the courses that are being submitted? And having a log that pops up ahead of time telling you whether they're highly qualified or not.
So that would be an understanding of the courses, your course catalog, and the certifications that are necessary, right? And then applying that with the data that's in your staff record, right?
Based on your assignment.
Based on your
Course
assignment.
number, probably course number and intent, teacher.
The support desk has a big long, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it lists all of the teacher certifications along with all the courses that would go along with that certification.
Right.
And
So having that would make your template for staff more accurate.
HQT, the course
For
HQT
HQT.
submission, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a thought.
Right. And making sure that your student information system vendor hears these ideas is pretty important. I mean, it may be that that makes great sense. Let's get it as an enhancement in the program. It may be there's another way of doing that. We could write a report that would identify that for you and see how that works out before it gets into the integration, right? But without asking, you'll never get there, right? And these things sometimes take time, right? But I can see the reason why I was saying we would have to know the course certifications and the relationship between that. I'm starting to think of the data elements that are involved in such a query, right? And then that then formulates into writing out for a client the idea, the questions that I can think of that our development team or the development team of your student information system would want to consider and might use as an obstacle to not doing something, right? And so when I write those things up, those are the initial thought process that I go through. Data available, what are the roles that are surrounding that, and the benefit that it would have to other schools, right? That would be very helpful. And I'll explore that one and follow up with you.
Yeah.
All right. So, I guess I'm at the conclusion stage here, and I'll bring these up so that we can talk more about it, right? We talked about the importance of documentation and supplemental resources, impact of having business rules built into a student information system. You think some of the things that we talked about in terms of business rules being built in would be helpful to you, having an understanding of that? Yeah. Checklist to increase staff involvement, whether or not you use the one that you create yourself or you build upon if you're an MMS client, you build upon the checklist that already exists inside the MMS help system. I think is a pretty key component, right? And I think using those validation reports as an oversight tool is rather helpful. And being able to send those out to staff certainly will make processing of your data, your PIMS data, easier by having better data. So with some of those built into your student information system, making PIMS less painful and processing easier with better data are the things that I had here to share with you today. Other questions? We could, you know, talk more about other ideas.
What was
Yes.
the bid service, system that you used?
So we have a cafeteria component called Lunchtime.
Okay, actually, every part of it.
It's offered by us, yes. So I've spoken with Mark, the food service director, a number of times, and that hasn't been the case. Yeah. And that's okay. I mean, some of these offerings, if something's not broken, I don't think it should be disrupted just for it, right? We can find a different path. That's a pretty valuable outcome, a byproduct of having it. One of the reasons why you might consider such a thing. Other ideas? For those of you that don't have MMS in the room, and I know that there are some here in the room itself, there are things that your student information system does that you find very valuable that we could maybe even integrate in our own student information system. Should I take that as a sign that we do this stuff really well? Yeah, that's good. I couldn't be upset with that. This is not a presentation on MMS. We don't quite know how to spell. We have our branding everywhere. You want to stop by our booth for a PIMS cocktail? Mike, I don't know if we brought that.
Absolutely.
I had one for the first time yesterday, and it was rather refreshing.